Yep, the negotiating strategies the Obama administration is learning. The Republicans. That's amazing out there. It's just amazing. This issue, by the way, of capturing externalities is there's a couple of areas where, broadly speaking, Americans had an understanding of these things 30, 40, 50 years ago, and because of 30 years of Republican domination of the media, Republican domination of our public school system, and the war against education that happened in the 1980s, the war against not just teachers' unions, but against textbooks and civics education, that people just don't get. People used to understand why labor was a good thing and the history of labor. It's not even taught in our schools anymore. People used to understand why externalities were a big deal. It's not even taught in our schools anymore. The whole idea of externalities is something that's not even considered anymore. That a company, that any kind of an activity, but particularly a for-profit company, on the one hand is doing something that's making a profit, and on the other hand is generating expenses. And some of those expenses are internal to the company, right? They've got to buy equipment, they've got to pay for their labor, they've got to pay their rent, all that kind of thing. And, those are the obvious expenses, and they pay those expenses. But some of those expenses are expenses that they dump off on you and me. And they dump them off on you and me because they're expenses that have to do with the common good. It used to be back, 50, 60 years ago, and this is why I said, people used to know about this and they don't now. I remember when the Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught on fire. I was a little kid when that happened, when that river caught on fire, because there were so many factories along that river that were discharging their toxic waste into the river. And refineries. They were just pouring it into the river. Everything in that river was dead. I remember when Lake Erie, I grew up in Michigan, right? I grew up in the Midwest. I lived in Detroit. We lived near Chicago. I grew up in Lansing. I was a program director on a radio station, both in Lansing, worked in Lansing radio for 10 years, also up in the Upper Peninsula. I've been all over that state. And I remember when Lake Erie was dead. There was virtually nothing alive in that lake. This was back in the 60s and 70s, because all of these companies were dumping all their waste in the lake. And we all figured it out in the 70s. Rachel Carlson came out with Silent Spring. I think that book was published in 65, as I recall. And everybody got it, that these companies were externalizing an expense, and that expense was being picked up by nature, and ultimately by us. They were dumping their waste in nature, and nature was something that was shared with us. And then the dioxin and the Love Canal and all these other things, and everybody understood this in the 70s, and the 60s and 70s and 80s. And we got really good about it, actually. And the EPA came in and we said, companies, you're going to have to clean up your act. And so now here we are 30 years later, and people, I would say probably the majority of people under the age of 30 or 35 have never even considered, and this is not a knock on them. I mean, this is just, I guess, back in the 60s and 70s, the work got done well. And tragically, this never got incorporated into school's curriculum, have never even considered the idea that corporate activity, in many cases, involves externalities that are intangible. In other words, they're externalizing expenses, they're externalizing waste, they're externalizing costs. They're not paying the costs. They're dumping them on somebody else. And the somebody else is the fish in our rivers, the birds in our air, the animals and plants around us, and perhaps most important from the human point of view, although I would argue that all of this is interrelated and equally important to humans as well as everything else, us. The cancer, the rates of cancers that are exploding, the rates of autism that are exploding, the rates of childhood diseases that are exploding, all of these things right across the board are the consequence of corporate activity where corporations are running off with the profits. Their CEOs are making millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. They're buying their corporate jets. When they get in trouble, they go for government bailout, which, by the way, is another externality, right? I mean, this is a classic example. Let's apply this to the banks. What was the externality here? The externality was the risk they took that they knew they could dump on us. If they didn't think that they could dump that risk on us, there was no externality. They would have had to pick it up. But because they could dump it on us, banks going belly up and taking $45 billion, that's enough money to hire a million people for $45,000 a year, which is the median income, more or less, close to the median income for the American family in America. I think I said worker before. It's with family income. It's enough to hire 1 million people for a year because they could get that money. They didn't care so much about what they were doing. Just like the oil companies, they don't care so much about, some people are getting some cancer. So Madison, Wisconsin comes along and says, we're going to put a plan in place to help out. We're going to plant greenery that's going to absorb carbon dioxide. We're going to prepare for a time when, there might be an oil supply disruption. We're now far more dependent on oil than we were in the 70s. When Louise and I lived in Detroit, we saw all hell break loose, literally. I mean, people were getting shot at gas stations. There was a shooting at a gas station just a mile from our house because you could only go odd or even, and people were cutting in lines, and these lines sometimes lasted 3 hours. Madison is getting ready. God bless them.